When it comes to creating an epic story, one of the hardest tasks for a writer is crafting a well-developed hero. If your protagonist is too powerful, then they can easily become unlikable. If they aren't confident or strong enough, then they could appear weak and unbelievable as a hero. You probably want your lead character to have some kind of sense of humor, but if you push it too far, they could easily come off as quite crass. There's simply a lot of variables you have to consider and master in order to mold a protagonist that we as an audience want to root for. However, I'd argue that this task becomes even more complex when you attempt to make a story headed by an antihero. With an antihero, a writer is attempting to create a character that is so truly likable that fans can excuse their somewhat reprehensible actions and still root for them to a certain extent. And this balance needs to be met, because if it isn't, then we as viewers will start to simply not care about your lead character. And obviously, disinterest from your audience will absolutely wreck a show. Now, if you're like me and are into watching all things film and television, you've likely noticed an uptick in the amount of narrative-based stories fronted by antiheroes. Breaking Bad, Dexter, The Last of Us, The Acolyte, Agatha All Along, Suicide Squad, The Suicide Squad, and Kraven the Hunter are a couple series and movies that come to mind from the past few decades as examples that fit into this trend. And today I want to really analyze the origins of this movement in film and television, and why it's something that writers opt to do so often, but also why it's really hard to stick the landing with an anti-hero fronted story. The anti-hero is a trope that has technically been around since the early days of storytelling, and can be tracked all the way back to ancient Greek theater, but in essence an anti-hero is a main character in a narrative who lacks conventional heroic qualities and attributes, such as idealism and morality. And although they sometimes perform actions that most of an audience would consider to be morally correct, their reasons for doing so may not align with said audience's morality. Now, the extent to which they lack heroism can vary quite a bit, but they are more than just a flawed hero. In some cases, the anti-hero of a story may even be seen as a horrible villain by those around them. Examples could range from mildly annoying characters like Dwight Schrute from The Office, to the utterly reprehensible Oswald Cobblepot from The Penguin. When it comes to the film world, the anti-hero trope began to really gain popularity with the rise of westerns and film noir in the late 30s and early 40s. And this is where I want to touch on something really important, and that is the fact that film and television mirrors what's happening in our society. At this point in history, we were dealing with the Great Depression and World War II, which created a massive shift in American culture, a loss of innocence if you will. And these hard-boiled Western and film noir leads who didn't really believe in the established American dream perfectly reflected the distrust that most citizens felt. The ideals that America were founded on were simply broken by the current events of the time. In the few decades that followed, with the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, and the Cold War, this general distrust would deepen and grow into a loss of faith in the government as well. Travis Bickle from Taxi Driver is a perfect reflection of this. I mean, he was a mentally damaged Vietnam veteran who wanted to assassinate a presidential candidate. Clint Eastwood's Dirty Harry was also a classic anti-hero from the 70s and fits perfectly into this trend, as he was a man who had no faith in the law and felt like he had to work around the forces that be in order to dole out proper justice. Now, I know that thus far I've primarily been using examples from film, but the silver screen would start to see an uptick of anti-heroes in the 2000s, which yet again correlates to a major historical occurrence in US history, that being 9/11. Seeing our airport security and government utterly fail to protect us from this terrorist attack created a new, greater fear within the American people, and in stepped lead television characters who worked outside of the law in order to dish out punishment to those who truly deserved it. Think of a figure like Dexter Morgan. I mean, Dexter was quite literally on a team that was meant to keep the Miami streets clean. Yet he still had to go out at night as the Bay Harbor Butcher to enact real justice to the criminals they were pursuing. And I think this correlation between current events of the time period and what gets put on the big and silver screen is natural because writers are often inspired, whether consciously or subconsciously, by their personal experiences. Many times, hell even most times, shows fronted by an anti-hero are great until they aren't. And what I mean by this is that ending these kind of shows is quite difficult because in a typical story, the hero or main character gets some sort of happy ending or completes some kind of arc of personal growth or great adventure. But with an anti-hero, they have to get some type of karma, because if they don't, it just isn't realistic. You can't kill a bunch of people or commit a slew of heinous actions and walk away scot-free just because you're charismatic or fun to watch. And this is where things get tricky for a writer, because with an anti-hero, the options are typically them dying, getting arrested, or being forced into some type of exile. But sometimes when a fanbase grows to love an anti-hero so much, you get cold feet about killing them off proper, or allowing them to receive proper punishment for their actions. And this is the tightrope that I was talking about in the intro of the video. You need your audience to like your anti-hero to a certain degree, so they keep watching, but not so much that they don't want them to face the consequences of their actions. And we've seen this struggle numerous times with a show like Dexter, where they absolutely botch the ending twice, maybe even 3 times depending on how Resurrection goes. They knew Dexter was a beloved character, so they got cold feet about killing him the first time. And then were so focused on killing him the second go around that they wrote backwards from that ending scene and created a rushed finale that felt forced and extremely out of place. And now they've had to retcon his death to hopefully end the story the right way. Maybe the 3rd time's the charm, but I kind of doubt it. Even with an amazing show like The Sopranos, they were really close to a great ending, but then they cut to black. They just didn't have the balls to show us Tony receiving his comeuppance. We waited 6 seasons to finally see this mobster get what was coming to him, only for them to not let us witness it. Now, Breaking Bad is seen as the gold standard for culminating a series in a satisfying way, and it certainly serves as this same gold standard for ending an anti-hero driven story as well. Walter White was a man who worked an average American job, had an average American family, developed average American lung cancer, and couldn't pay his average American medical bills. So naturally, we root for him at first and give him our sympathies. We know cooking meth is wrong, but we give him a pass for it. However, as the series ramps up and Walt's heinous actions also increase, you eventually stop rooting for him. So given this and his terminal cancer, naturally the sensible culmination of his story would be to die. But Vince Gilligan did something brilliant because he gave Walt a sacrificial death. He had the wherewithal to create an entity even more heinous than Walt himself, so that Mr. White could sit perfectly in between the lead villains, those being the neo-Nazis, and the hero of the story, that being Jesse Pinkman. And because these neo-Nazis killed Hank and have been torturing Jesse for years, our desire to see them die is even greater than our desire to see Walt perish. So what we have is a badass final scene where Walt kills the bad guys, saves the good guy, and ultimately bleeds out and receives his punishment for his actions. It is perfect to a T. A show like Barry also comes to mind when I think of a proper anti-hero's journey. Barry being shot dead by his acting teacher was fucking awesome, and I'm really glad that the show had the balls to do it. Because while he was a messed up dude, Barry was also really funny and kind of lovable in a weird way. So I'm sure there may have been some doubts about whether killing him was the right decision. Joel Miller also had a great anti-hero's ending, and his is a little more complex because he dies before the end of his series, but regardless of how you feel about the rest of The Last of Us Part 2, Joel made an extremely morally questionable decision by killing all of the Fireflies, and he received ramifications for those actions. Yes, he was a fascinating character, debatably the best in the entire series, but when you realize why Abby did what she did, it's more than understandable. And to have the guts and the cojones to do something like this to your lead anti-hero is an absolute must if you want to properly culminate their story. Ultimately, the anti-hero is typically a reflection of the societal hardships we as a human race are facing, because writers are often inspired by experiences in their own lives. And well, I'd say we've been in a period of great turmoil in the past decade or so, given the uptick in these types of films and television series. However, as is evident by the shaky track record of concluding these stories, I think it's very important to be willing and fully prepared to kill or punish your lead character when the time comes. Because at the end of the day, an anti-hero isn't a hero, no matter how much we as an audience might come to love them. Well, if you made it this far, I'd love to hear who your favorite anti-hero of all time is. You know, a complicated character who you just couldn't help but root for. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more Screen Stories content. Thank you for watching, and until next time, peace.